I think a presentation that will have struck everyone here as remarkable in its range, in its global range, in the fact of mentioning the UN and NATO signing a memorandum of understanding. And your presentation really did answer implicitly the question that I posed, with the idea that NATO is very much involved and will be involved in the shaping of new rules as we go along, and necessarily so, and is eager to do so. But it does lead us into an area of some uncertainty, and our speakers from Estonia and from the European Parliament and Thierry de Montbrial have all laid some emphasis on it this morning, so I wanted to bring it directly to you. And that is some of the lessons to be learned from the events of the 8th of August this year, the conflict between Russia and Georgia. Which seems to many people to have been a case of NATO having incurred a certain moral responsibility toward a country by the discussion of membership action plans, by the discussion and indeed the adoption of a resolution that says that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO at some point. There is the extension of a moral responsibility, at least on NATO's part, toward a country that it is not actually prepared, not actually able to protect. How do you resolve that? Are we going to see more of that as we continue into an era of new rules? What is NATO's responsibility at this point toward Georgia?
Let me start by answering you, Jim, that I think that what has happened in early August, and it was said before this morning, results finally, and I'm not in this regard that interested in who started what and when, results finally in the changing of borders in Europe by force. And I think we can simply not accept that. That, I think, is the bottom line. My second remark is that I think we were lucky and are lucky that we saw a very proactive European Union presidency. Because without Sarkozy's proactivity, things might be worse than they are now. So I think, also looking to my neighbor and friend Gerd Pöttering, I think the European Union really showed that it can bring political influence to bear. In a scenario, by the way, where the EU, in the direct aftermath of the conflict, was in a much better position to do this than NATO. I come to your question, and basically it is, of course, on my last remarks, which might have been slightly unscripted. At least they were not in my text. I think the bottom line should be this: you cannot say that if nations who fulfill the criteria, that's a precondition, and no nation fulfills the criteria at the moment. Georgia doesn't, and Ukraine doesn't. But if nations, and in Ukraine, and I look at my friend Yatsenyuk, if Georgia and Ukraine, the people of Georgia and Ukraine, would finally say, we would like to be member of that family of nations called NATO, you need strong arguments to say, no, you can't. Now, I know, looking at my former colleague and friend Igor Ivanov here in the first row, I know that this is not an easy process. And I immediately admit that Russia has interests, and that Russia has interests we should take into account. I'm not of the group who says this is going to be easy and Russia has no interest. Russia has interest. Russia should not have changed borders by force. Russia should never have recognized Abkhazia and Ossetia. If you ask me, does NATO has a moral right, a moral obligation? NATO has an obligation to support Georgia. And NATO has an obligation to draw the consequences, I do not know when, of the Bucharest Declaration by its heads of state and government. And if you mention membership action plan, Jim, that is, of course, because of the Bucharest summit, a now highly politicized element. It has become a politicized element. It was let's say, a stage on the long and winding road to NATO membership. But I think we should stay away from any vetoes or droit de regards in this regard. NATO has an obligation to support Georgia. NATO's decision will never be an automatic one. When it will take place, I do not know. But the Bucharest decision was and is an important one. Finally, and Tom Ilves knows what's going to come now, I always quote in my public appearances the President of Estonia when he says, and I say with him, what could be the concern of having the rule of law, the respect for human rights and democracy coming closer to one's borders? I don't see that.
Let me just follow up, though, just so I make sure I understand. You've told us what Russia should not have done in this situation. You've also told us that Russia has interest in this situation. Tell us what Russia should have done vis-a-vis Georgia.
Well, Russia, first of all, should have refrained from the use of the disproportionate force, which has been condemned by the European Union member states, by the NATO member states. Secondly, I think Russia made a big mistake in recognizing Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Whatever President Medvedev and Prime Minister Putin might think about the rest, I think recognition, which has relatively isolated Russia, because I think there are not that many nations as we speak having recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So there I think a mistake was made, and we need a political debate, in my opinion, of hopefully reversing that decision. Because acquiescing in that decision means that you accept the change of borders by force. And I think it was already said this morning that can have consequences not only in Georgia, but elsewhere in the world as well. Now, there will be a conference mid-October, and I hope that can be the beginning. NATO will show solidarity with Georgia in this respect. NATO will assist. NATO will help Georgia on its road to Euro-Atlantic integration. I don't know about the when, but the Bucharest decision by heads of states and government of NATO stands.
I think one lesson that many observers have drawn from this crisis has been that for the European Union, it is very important to have, as you're occupying your presidency, a country with significant size and power, and a leader who acts first and consults second whenever Russia is going to invade another country.